I thought I'd do a little video on the T word. Now, if I say this word to knitters, to experienced knitters, not all experienced knitters, I feel like I'm swearing at them or I'm asking about their personal hygiene. It's like I'm saying, I don't know, how often do you shower or something? Some people get a little bit offended, and it's not meant as an offence, obviously, but I can understand why, because it's sometimes a little bit of a mystery, and that is tension. The very word tension, tense. So you'll find the Americans, and a lot of American patterns use the word gauge. So I've been writing patterns now for over 20 years, and I've always used tension as to explain tension. And just recently, due to the World Wide Web, we find that a lot of American patterns use gauge. And sometimes gauge is a nicer explanation than tension, because gauge sounds nice. Tension, what's your gauge? Now, I reword this now to say, I don't say how's your tension. It's not relevant really, but what's the gauge, what's the tension? So what does all that mean? And it, like I said, it's a bit of a mystery. So you might hear the terms tight tension, loose tension. And this is where I think maybe together we can come up with a different word for tight and loose. Because it's not really a tight tension, it's not really a loose tension. I do professional finishing workshops, and I, spoiler alert, get people to do tension squats. And 50% of the people at that workshop, any workshop, will get the gauge, the tension, to what it's supposed to be. And 20%, 50% don't. So for some people, tension gauge never comes into their life, and for others, it will. So what is tension gauge? Briefly, it is the amount of stitches per 10 centimetres, 4 inches that determine the size of something. So if you found that your garments never fit, they're too big or too small, that might have, there are other explanations, but that might have something to do with how many stitches to 10 centimetres, the tension, the gauge. It's not, though, about how tight you knit or how loose you knit. So you might look at the fabric that you've knitted and say, oh, it doesn't look tight, it doesn't look loose. No, it won't. It will look perfect. It will look beautiful. You've knitted it. It will look good. It is the amount of stitches that differ to what the pattern says. So if you've got a pattern, for sake of argument, that says 20 stitches per 10 centimetres, you might have a yarn that gives you 19 stitches to 10 centimetres. And that means your garment, or whatever you're knitting, will be bigger. And this is sometimes where it gets confusing. If you have 21 stitches instead of 20, your garment, whatever you're knitting, will be smaller. But it doesn't mean to say that the 19 stitches looks loose. It's a looser tension. And it doesn't mean to say that 21 stitches looks tight. That's a tighter tension. It's just that those stitches are more than what they should be, and the other one is less than what it should be. So that's why sometimes it can be confusing, because you think, I'm not a tight knitter, I'm not a loose knitter. No, you're not. It's just the yarn you've chosen is creating that tension. Or it could just be on those needles, that's what you get. So for example, with Aran weight or worsted, a lot of people suggest, a lot of designers knit that on 5mm needles to get, for sake of argument, 18 stitches. Maybe the stitch amount isn't helping, but say for example 5mm needles is needed for your Aran worsted weight yarn. I have to knit on 4.5 to get the correct tension to a pattern. That's just how it was. When I was younger, I had to knit on a higher needle. And I remember the first time I came across this tension malarkey because, like out there, you might never speak to another knitter, or you might have a group of knitters that are all the same as you. Because I was the same before the burst of the internet as it is now. And I came across a knitter, a fabulous knitter, and she would use 3.25mm needles for DK, whereas I was using 4, and sometimes I had to go up to 4.5 at that time. And I was like, what? You're using 3.25mm needles for DK? It blew my mind. And when I looked at her yarn, it was exactly the same. Her fabric that she knitted, it looked exactly the same as mine. So sometimes some knitters do have to use different size needles to what it says in the pattern. And that, for some people, is another thing that blows their mind. So that's why you'll also find patterns nowadays which will say not tell you the needle size, which there's pros and cons for that. I still keep a needle size in at this present moment in time, although it depends when you're watching these. But yeah, at this present moment in time, still put a needle size in as a starter. Starter as it were. So I'll show you what I mean physically. So all of these are DK weight yarns, and they've all been knitted with the same amount of stitches. They all look fine. You wouldn't say any of these are tight, loose. They're all a nice fabric. But this one has a looser tension than this one, and this one has a tighter tension to this one because this one is smaller. So same amount of stitches, still looks good, doesn't look like it's tight or loose, but it's a tighter tension to this one. So if the pattern was calling for this DK weight yarn, or used a DK weight yarn like this, and you chose a DK weight yarn, I should just say DK yarn. I'm being old-fashioned with the weight bit. DK yarn that looks like this, your tension would be tighter than what the pattern says, but not for the yarn. So this is, I think, sometimes what confuses. So even though these are the same amount of stitches, in comparison, this is a looser tension to this one, and this is a tighter tension to this one, even though they both aren't tight or aren't loose. And that's where it's important to get the right tension. So not what it looks like, but how many stitches. And so that's the same with these. So there might be a slight difference, but can you see, same amount of stitches, but they're all slightly, same amount of stitches, same amount of rows. So I've not done less rows on these, same amount of rows. And that also comes into play with yarn amounts, which is another thing I might mention in another message video. And just to go to extremes, same amount of stitches, same amount of rows, different weight yarns. I think this is a 2-ply and this is an Aran. This is a tighter tension to this one. So if you knitted this, that is the size you get. Same rows, same stitches. So that is what it means by tension. And hopefully that is helping some people clear up a few little hiccups they may have had. Okay.